I'm so excited to welcome all of you to the first fall 2021 program of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. My name is Ken Bamberger. I'm a professor here at the law school and one of the faculty directors of the Institute. You're joining us today for session one of a four-part year-long virtual lunchtime series on civil society and plurality in Israel. We'll hear from leading scholars about critical social and political issues and movements across Israeli society, including questions of religion and gender and nationality, multiculturalism, pluralism, and equality. Today's session one on religion and state, features Mikhail Karayanni, who will be in conversation with Masua Sagiv about his new book, A Multicultural Entrapment, Religion and State Among the Palestinian-Arabs in Israel. Mikhail is the Bruce W. Wayne Professor of International Law, my favorite title of a chair, in the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he recently completed his term of Dean of the Law Faculty. And this spring, he'll be the Daniel Fishel and Sylvia Neal Distinguished Visiting Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School. Professor Karayanni looks through lenses of culture and religion in extraordinary ways to examine how what are sometimes taught and researched as the most procedural or legalistic arenas of the law, jurisdiction, choice of law, conflicts of laws, are actually among the key features in determining law's reach, law's political and social effects, and law's impact on people's daily lives. In other words, how these procedural questions are really questions about power. And those were the subjects of his last book, Conflicts in a Conflict, where he looked at the way choice of law rules, sovereign immunity, and other jurisdictional doctrines have affected the residents of the Palestinian territories in their daily lives. Today, he'll talk about his fantastic new book, A Multicultural Entrapment, turning those lenses onto questions of religious autonomy and religious freedom. He'll be in conversation with Masua Sagiv, the 2021-2022 Koret Visiting Assistant Professor of Jewish and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley, and a scholar in residence at the Shalom Hartman Institute. She was most recently the academic director of the Menomadin Center for Jewish and Democratic Law at the Bar-Ilan University Faculty of Law. And I'm so grateful to both of you for being here. I'll note that in the latter part of their discussion, we'll draw on questions from the Q&A box. So please feel free at any time to submit questions there. Please welcome Professor Karayanni and Professor Sagiv.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. We're very excited to be here to talk about this wonderful book. I had the honor to talk about this book once before when we had an evening for celebrating the release of the book in Israel. And I think what was amazing to see the different scholars from different disciplines, each of them saw something. They each would say, well, this book is primarily about gender, or this book is primarily about social change, or this book is primarily about private international law. And I think this is something of something so special about this book that we'll have a chance to work with or to take apart perhaps today. So I'm very happy for this conversation, and thank you, Mikhail, for joining me in this conversation. So I think perhaps as a starter for our conversation, since I think that most of our audience is American, I want us to talk for a bit about the difference constitutional framework between Israel and the United and a lot of Western countries, really, but specifically the United States, when we're talking about religion and state. As perhaps some of you or all of you know, Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. So the Jewish religion, specifically Orthodox Judaism, is an established religion, and this have constitutional implications on how Israel looks in its laws, in its customs, in its public arena. And I think this is very crucial for understanding after that the framework, the novel framework you suggest in your book. So Michael, do you want to start us with to take the conversation from there, perhaps?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. And thank you to Ken, Rebecca, Maya, and Sarah, and to you, Masua, for all having me. And then it's a pleasure to be back, at least virtually, in Berkeley, and to share my work. Actually, the whole book, the whole project, kicks off by posing this, what I think is a fundamental question, is that when we discuss religion and state in Israel, it's an intra-Jewish question. It deals with the conflict between recognition accorded to Jewish religious institutions and norms on the one hand, and liberalism, democracy as Israel perceives it on the other hand. But when we look at religion and state in many other countries, including in the US, but not just in the US, we find that the discussion very much, not totally, but very much also about minority religions. So when I am in the States and would be looking at religion and state, you would be teaching Reynolds the issue of polygamy among the Mormons, the Amish, whether they should have autonomy in homeschooling their children, the Yoder case. It would be touching on different issues of minorities, the seventh witness, the Jehovah's Witness, and blood transfusion, and I think you can add a lot of other cases that you probably know much better than I do, where minorities are taking center stage in the discussion. And we move on to Europe, right? And you also find minority religions at the center of the religion and state discussion. In France, the issue of the veil. I mean, in England, the issue of even the Sikh turban. You had the Supreme Court of England dealing with the question of who's a Jew in the admission of a child, of a pupil, to a school, a Jewish school. In London, the issue of the burqa, the issue of male circumcision, of halal and kosher slaughter of animals. It's very much in the discussion. But when we move into Israel, all of a sudden there is this silence on the issues of minority religions and the concentration on the Jewish majority issues. Even to the level, and this is something I cite also in the book, that when you look at the leading commentary on constitutional law in Israel, and you go to the subject index, you look up the religion and state in Israel, you'd find a religious state, datum dinar umidina Yehudi, which is amazing, right? Because Israel is about more than 20% non-Jewish, Palestinian-Arab mostly. And this minority is very much diverse in terms of religious affiliation. You have 10 different Christian communities that happen to be recognized, and the Muslim and the Druze and even the Baha'is, right? Who maybe come to almost just 200 people are a recognized religion. And these communities have raised a lot of questions, not just about their freedom of practicing their religion, but even more diverse than you would find even in the US or in Europe. Okay, so you find issues of recognizing whether a court sitting in Lebanon would have jurisdiction over Christians sitting in Israel. Okay, or you discuss the issue of a Sharia court in East Jerusalem that Israel regards as part of its sovereign territory, exercising jurisdiction over the West Bank. Is that something that should be recognized? Okay, and this is just, you know, the tip of the iceberg. So you'd find also issues about whether a Muslim student at a Catholic school in Nazareth should be admitted to the school and come with her veil, or can the school restrict her from coming to the school with the veil? You'd find another case discussed in the Supreme Court whether Muslim religious students should be recognized just as yeshiva students in terms of state support. It's the Watad case, right? You'd find cases dealing with discriminating Arab religious communities as opposed to the Jewish community when it comes to budget, to state budgets. So one famous case found that Arab religious communities would be accorded only 2% of the budget of what was then the Ministry of Religious Affairs, whereby they are 20% of the population. Is that discrimination? So these are very strong religion and state issues that happen to be absent, even though they are present from the discussion. And in the book, the first chapter actually surveys all of these cases. Much of the literature which I managed to collect, which I guess it's all of the literature that exists, where you would find the Palestinian Arab minority really excluded from the discussion. And this actually is what got the discussion kicked off. And then the second question I asked, just continuing the first, is why is it? Why is this exclusion? I mean, the Palestinian minority inside of Israel is widely discussed in the literature. You'd find books ranging from a lot of issues in terms of the status of the Palestinian Arab minority inside of Israel. You'd find books even dealing and a lot of articles on specific religious communities. It might be the Muslim, it might be the Christians, it can be also the Druze, and you'd find discussion, but never within the context of the religion and state. So
perhaps I'm sorry, Mikhail, I'm
sure.
just to illuminate this, and this is, okay, I think perhaps really puzzling, since the definition of the state is arguably religious or at least cultural. So religion is very much is very strong. Is very strong inside Israel, but still you see this exclusion. So perhaps you can before we'll talk about the framework, can you please comment on this?
Well, that's the issue. Is Judaism is Judaism the official state religion of Israel? Is that the question, Masua? Because of the definition. I think so, but until I wrote this book, you would find people not really being explicit about it, saying that Judaism is favored, but it's not like an established official state religion. And I think it is. And this is part of the explanation that I started offering. Why is there this exclusion? So according to the thesis I propose in the second chapter, I make a matrix that defines religion and state relations by a set of victors, of powers, of paradigms that would define that relationship. So I play on the public and the private, and I take up also the issue of coercion or illiberal and liberal religious accommodation. And once I put this matrix together, then it came clear to me why this exclusion happens, and it happens almost naturally, right? One is public. Judaism, as I say, and I try to offer my evidence to that account, Judaism is the official state religion of the state of Israel. Its status is not like any other religion. It goes to the definition of Israel as a Jewish state in terms of the religious component of Judaism, and not just the national or the cultural, as some would argue. Religion is part and parcel of what the Jewish state is about, the Jewish religion. And I go to the law of return even, which is one of the most defining laws of Israel as a Jewish state, where you would have the definition of a Jew that happens to be predominantly religious in terms of its standard. So Judaism, with the recognition offered to Jewish religious institutions and the vast funding that goes to these institutions, is the public, and it's the official, and it is the established state religion in Israel. The recognition offered to Jewish religious institutions is uncomparable to any other in the state of Israel. The chief rabbinate, the religious councils, the religious seat on the Supreme Court, settlements in the occupied territories. It's part and parcel of what Israel is today in terms of its definition as a Jewish state. But when it comes to the Palestinian-Arab religious communities, my argument is that they're part of Israel's private sphere. Who is a Muslim or who is a Christian Catholic is not a question that bothers anyone in terms of the Israeli establishment. As far as Israel is concerned, you can define yourself as a Muslim or as a Christian the way you like to define yourself. It's not my issue. It's your issue. It's your private issue. And look at the recognition that is offered to the non-Jewish religious communities. It's almost like, recognizing the incorporation of a private corporation, right? The Baha'is, 200 people maybe in Israel, recognized as an official state religion, as not an official state, but as a recognized religion. The Syrianic religion, a Christian religion, is almost maybe 1,500 people, and it's recognized. But look at the conservative and then the Reform Judaism, how tough it is to recognize, because when you deal with such recognition, it's not as simple. It's not as easy. It touches on the issue of who can marry who, Jewish unity, the self-definition of Israel. It's public. The other component of this matrix is the illiberal and the liberal values. So when judged in terms of democratic and liberal values, the Jewish religious institutions and norms, the recognition accorded thereto, comes out as being coercive, illiberal, undemocratic. So Chaim Cohen would be saying the recognition accorded to the rabbinical court is a blot on Israel's democratic rule. Secularism in Israel, you'd find it also centered on the Jewish community. It doesn't deal with the Palestinian-Arab religious communities, and that is explained because that recognition, when it is offered, it's liberal, but secularism in Israel is against coercion. So it picks up, right, only the Jewish religious recognition. So secularism is one, or religious coercion as an issue, as a public matter, kfiyah datit in Hebrew, right? You'd find all sorts of organizations from the 60s until today dealing and trying to combat religious coercion, but they're also centered on the Jewish community. But when it comes to that Palestinian Arab religious communities, that recognition is liberal. Israel even brags about the recognition it is offering the Palestinian Arab religious communities in its official documents, and is even condemning at the time Egypt, because Egypt has abolished Sharia courts and other religious courts. Look at Egypt, how bad Egypt under Jamal Abdel Nasser then in 1956 or 55 is doing, and how tolerant we happen to be in Israel. We're recognizing Sharia courts, the Christian courts, and not even just recognizing, it's bragging about these courts even having a wider jurisdictional authority than the rabbinical courts. And this goes on and on in many of the texts that I observed in the book. You'd find Yitzhak Kahan, who would become the president of the Israeli Supreme Court, saying this is a matter of cultural autonomy, the religious jurisdiction. So we don't want to intervene too much. But the Jewish we see the Supreme Court intervening more. And you'd find Yitzhak Engard. So from their conception, right, when they're looking at the religious authority and they want to be liberal, their liberalism would be trying to restrict, not necessarily Yitzhak Kahan, but other liberal justices on the Supreme Court, okay? Their liberalism, given what I've just identified, would be working to restrict rabbinical jurisdiction, but not necessarily the jurisdiction of the Sharia courts. It's odd, it seems to be incompatible, but then if this is liberalism as it plays out, it does make sense. And this is why I explain the exclusion of the Palestinian Arab religious issues from the religion and state in Israel, because religion and state in Israel is concentrated on the public sphere and what is coercive. And once that is the case, then by definition, it excludes what is perceived to be private and liberal. It's moved to some other sphere and it's unrelated. And that's how I explained the anomaly that I just spoke about on before. Now, I must be, just to be complete, some people would say, well, religion and state is not part of the discussion because the Arab community happens to be more acquiescent to that religious authority, and they don't challenge that religious authority as the Jewish community does in terms of coming to court. That is not true. That many petitions did reach the Supreme Court from the start of the state until today, and these petitions happen to be diverse in their nature, as I've tried to also explain before. And just to give you, I'll give you the floor back, Masua. But the second half of the book deals with this question: is it really liberal? And what I would identify as being multicultural, this recognition granted to these minority religions in Israel. I mean, that is evidently the narrative. This is the story. But does what appear to be liberal and multicultural really qualify? And what are the implications of deeming or regarding this religious authority as being multicultural. What does that mean when it comes to individuals who happen to be under the jurisdiction of the Sharia courts or the Christian courts, when the Israeli establishment, and not just the Israeli establishment, I also argue that the political representatives of the Palestinian Arab minority also share the same sentiment, at least to the outside, that this jurisdictional authority is a matter of autonomy. It's a matter of a multicultural accommodation of sort. But if you regard that jurisdictional authority in terms of the group as such, then what does that imply in terms of individuals that happen to be subject to that jurisdictional authority, especially women and children, given that this jurisdictional authority, like any religious authority, is patriarchal, and it's not accommodating to individual liberty and equality when it comes to women and children. So the second point I'm trying to make is that once you conceive it as multicultural and liberal, you're undermining, right? And this is a classic dilemma in multiculturalism. You're undermining the individual liberty of people who happen to be subject or governed by that group, and especially if it's religious. So that's what I call the predicament, or the individual predicament of Palestinian women and children, because to call on the government to intervene, there's a legitimacy deficit. For the government to intervene, it also faces a legitimacy deficit. That state itself is supportive of this regime, because, as I argue, it divides the minority, which is a security threat, into various religious communities, and it's better controlled that way. The minority representatives are at ease with it, because to raise the issue, to argue against that religious authority, would raise issues of cracking that community from within, which would undermine the political national struggle of the main parties that happen to be secular, but it's not on the agenda to do so.
Can we,
Mikhail,
can we try? But when you're talking about this, about the different interests, I would love for us to try to do it a bit more methodically, you know what I mean, and to really distinguish the different interests at play, because you present a very fascinating framework, and perhaps we'll talk more in a bit about where does it come from, and why is that? Why is Judaism perceived as public and minority religions perceived as private? We'll try to understand more what does it mean for Israeliness, really. But before that, I would really, and you started it now, but I would really, I urge you to distinguish the different interests at play. So we have different players here, different actors here. So we have the state, the different stakeholders. So we have the state, obviously, and we have the different groups, leaderships, and we have the individuals. And each of them, and it's so interesting, when I, in my research on religious feminists in Israel, I see that a lot of the problems are shared between Jewish women and between Arab Palestinian women, whether they are Christian or Muslim. And you see more and more, but you don't see a lot of coalitions in struggles for social change. And it's interesting to understand why. So we have, you started to talk about the state and the legitimacy deficit, but what is the state's interest? What is the leadership's interest, and how does it contradict or conflicts with the individuals? What would you say, what would you tell an individual or an activist how can they deal with this entrapment, with intersectionality conflicts when they come to face this multiculturalism entrapment in Israel?
Okay. Well, much of the discussion about multiculturalism and how it plays out in terms of individual rights is centered on the jurisdiction offered to religious courts. The rabbinical courts on the one hand, and the Sharia and the Christian courts, and even the Druze court on the other hand. And the reason why I've centered the discussion on the jurisdiction of these religious courts is that it's something that I can compare, given that there isn't much to compare besides the recognition offered to Palestinian-Arab religious communities, because not much is recognized in terms of their religious institutions and norms beyond. So there is no religious councils, there is no chief Muslim council of a sort. So it really takes up the issue of, then in the second half of the book, the issue of religious jurisdiction, and what does it mean to regard such a religious jurisdiction as illiberal and coercive on the one hand, and being a multicultural or tolerant or liberal on the other hand. Now, having said this, and given that this is what I concentrate on, I should go back to a historical fact that Israel did not invent this jurisdictional authority. Israel really inherited it from the British Mandate, and the British Mandate inherited it from the Ottoman Empire, which is the Millet system that was in place. So the Millet system really continued from the Ottomans into the Mandate system, and then Israel adopted it. So what is special in terms of this historical fact to the Israeli reality? Well, in the book, I also make the point that even though you might have the same system being operational under different regimes, and it can be even the same system itself, still the motivation of having such a system can vary, even though the system itself is left intact. So the Ottomans were motivated by different factors. Partially, they were even motivated by Islamic Sharia that tended to the issue of Ahl al-Kitab or Ahl al-Dhimmi, the people of the book, or the protected people. That a Quranic verse would offer Christians and Jews some kind of recognition if they would pay a certain tax, and that recognition what was followed, not just absolutely by the Ottomans, but it was part of maybe of what motivated the Ottomans. But then you would agree with me that the Quran is not what motivated the state of Israel when it adopted the same system, right? So this is just, to make an obvious point that you can have the same system, but it can be driven by different interests. And the British, they had a colonial policy of a sort that they would not mend with these issues in their colonies. And that's what and this is the last thing maybe they wanted to touch upon when they had the mandate over Palestine. And so the Israelis had their own consideration, even though they had more or less the same structure. I wouldn't go into the details because it's too complicated. Anyway, so if Israel adopted the Millet system, it's not because the Ottomans did, it's because it had its own interests. And this is something I also concentrate upon. One interest is that they didn't want to upset this delicate issue with religious Jewish factor, the status quo letter, that wanted to safeguard some kind of a unity, given the perceived threats of the Jewish community at the time. And you can probably add that if it left the Millet system for the Jews, it wouldn't even touch the issue of the Palestinian. That's one factor. It has been well documented, but I argue that there are additional factors, and this is not the sole factor. And so the Palestinians at the time, there were only about 150,000 after the 1948 war. Their Nakba, they were eliteless. They didn't have a leadership that they have today, pressing on the government. They were governed by military government. Confiscation of land was vast. Unifications of family of people who've tried to take refuge somewhere outside of what was Palestine to come back was restricted. So Israel could have done anything with the Palestinian Arab minority at the time. And it had its own motives, and it's well documented in the book and in some of the documents that I also reveal. Israel was keen on preventing that minority from becoming one national unit, and was keen on controlling that minority by dividing it into different religious, or maintaining the religious divides among them. And the millet system proved to be some kind of a natural treasure that was offered to Israel, and so it maintained it. So this is one explanation. Another explanation is about endogamy. It's a Jewish interest. Whenever you raise the issue of having a civil marriage in Israel, one of the arguments raised against having it, mixed marriages and the delusion of Jewish identity, or what would happen to Jewish unity. And so we need to preserve, right, the exclusive jurisdiction of the rabbinical courts to ensure Jewish unity, which goes to Israel's definition as a Jewish state. And so one other way of ensuring endogamy is that you maintain it among the others. You can't, just have it among the Jews and not have it among the Muslims and Christians, offer them some kind of an option. And then that would be a precedent, and that. So I always demonstrate that to my students. One way of preserving identity is by preserving also the identity of others. Without preserving the identity of others in a state where the state is full of different people, you risk losing your own as well. So that was also an interest that I would define as going to the Jewish national character. Now, the Palestinian Arabs were also stakeholders as they became more powerful and more galvanized and more aware of their reality. And we advance into the late 60s, 70s, 80s. Now, right? They are also stakeholders. You'd find a lot of people, right, among the Palestinians that happen to be secular, but secularism is not a movement. You even take the Communist Party or Balad that are secular parties, right? They don't have a religious agenda. Their agenda is nationalistic. And you would find also the secular agenda absent from their activism. They call upon very ideals of liberalism and human rights. But then when it comes to issues of religious jurisdiction, they're almost silent. I wouldn't be saying totally silent, but the religious leadership is totally silent. Now, it's not because they accept it. It's because of having stakes at the issue. If they would be, raising this issue, they would also be dealing with a lot of contempt from within the community, because certain portions, maybe even considerable portions, I don't know, but certain portions among the Palestinian Arabs would object. And this is an internal crack. Now, I also argue, and this is something I didn't really make clear in the book because it wasn't that evident then when I wrote it, but it's evident to me now, given the kind of competition that exists today between Balad and Hadash, the communist and Balad on the one hand, and the Muslim Islamic-led Mansour Abbas movement on the other, maybe the communist and Balad would even be more reserved from dealing with religious issues because that would, make the competition more in favor of Mansour Abbas, and this is the last thing they want to do. So you can see how this can play out politically. But
so we have a double and maybe even a multiple entrapment here, because each player has no incentive to change the situation, because I mean, you have the state that say, I'll be damned if I cancel it and I'll be damned if I continue it, or for me it's good to continue it. You have the leadership of whether it's the secular or the religious, the religious leadership obviously wants to continue with it because it has its autonomy. The secular leadership says, well, I can't let it hurt my national struggle or my national movement. And the individual itself is also, it's usually against the women and the children. Again, it's the women and the children. They are marginalized. And they're saying that if I go against my religion or my group, I'm not going only against religion, which is difficult by itself. I also go out against my national struggle. So it's really, it's such a strong entrapment that it's almost no one has a motivation to break it.
Even the feminists among the Palestinians inside of Israel and even in the occupied territories, feminism in a lot of places is anti-nationalistic. But in a state of conflict, and this is, the big elephant or the elephant or whatever it is in the room, when in a state of conflict, feminism, at least in the literature I've read, happen to be, more reserved than being non-nationalistic. They even happen to be a lot of feminists, maybe even pro-nationalistic. They're for their national emancipation on the one hand, so they're more reserved in taking a stand maybe against the current national leadership, which make their struggle from within even harder. So they can't, they want to be within the national movement on the one hand, but they're raising the cause of women who happen to be restricted in terms of their own individual liberty on the other hand. And how you manage this is a very delicate issue as well. So
let's, can we, I'm just seeing that we are we're starting to run out of time, and I want us to talk more about strategy. And it's interesting when between your chapters 5 and 6, it's almost anticlimactic, because you raise and you give us such a rich framework, and you raise the problem, and we see and we feel it throughout the book, this entrapment and this problem. And then when we expect perhaps a suggestion or a solution, we see something very cautious, something very moderate. And when you're talking about strategy, in a way, you describe existing strategies, and in a way, it's a bit like the state. It's still keeping it a minority issue, still keeping it equality discussion. It's not saying, well, let's abolish the whole religious court system. It's following Jewish activist steps in courts. And when I'm thinking, when I'm conceptualizing theories of social change, you have basically you have two theories of social change. It has different names. They have different names in different disciplines, but basically it's evolution and revolution. You can either propose or promote small changes, specific changes, and without destroying the framework, or you try to destroy the whole social order or religious order or legal order and try to replace it with a different one. And it seems that the strategies that we see at chapter 6 are very, very moderate, very cautious. I'm doing like this movement because that's how it felt when I read chapter 6, and I also, again, I see it in religious feminists' struggles within the Jewish society in Israel. It's very interesting to hear your interpretation for this strategy.
Okay. Well, thank you. To understand what I say in chapter 6 is really it's crucial to understand what I say in chapter 5, because it's a prognosis to a diagnosis I make early. And so without a proper diagnosis, I can't make the prognosis. And the prognosis I offer, it's not my wishful thinking. Take me as a physician, and you're dealing with certain kind of a medical condition. You know, this is what I can do. This is what can be done. And this is what I can do to mitigate the condition. If it was up to me, I would eliminate the whole condition in terms of you know, existing religious authority, which is exclusive, without me having the option to choose. If it was up to me, okay, I would you know, give people the opportunity to choose whatever they would like in terms of their personal status. But this is not the condition I'm dealing with. I'm confronting this entrapment, okay, which has a lot of stakeholders positioned, and it's not that I can change this. So what can I do under the circumstances? And this is what I do in chapter 6, which I would relate to. But first, I would like to say what my diagnosis is, which is the entrapment, before I get to the prognosis in chapter 6. Well, the argument I make, and this is part of maybe the movement for change, is that what might seem to be multicultural and liberal actually does not qualify as such, even though it is seemingly so. And it's easy, and a lot of people actually do, and this is where I start from, right? To see the jurisdictional authority of the Palestinian-Arab minority in Israel as something which is tolerant, as something which is actually multicultural. It's accommodating their cultural autonomy in a sense, which I perceive mostly as being, with all due respect, as Orientalist and essentialist in one respect. But before I reach that, what are the qualifications for having some kind of a group regime that operates on a group level to qualify as being multicultural, right? So when I look at the multiculturalism as my theory, my guiding theory, I find what I perceive as being qualification factors. What qualifies to be a group regime that is multicultural? Because, and I think many would agree with me, not every group instituted sets of rights and obligations would be considered to be multicultural. I mean, if that would have been so, I think, you know, U.S. segregated U.S. would have qualified as being multicultural because it was group-based. But not everything which is apartheid would also qualify, right? Even Nazi Germany would qualify as being multicultural. Not everything which is group-based is multicultural. So what does qualify as being multicultural? And this is what I offer as being multicultural qualifications. First of all, right, The multicultural qualification is to protect the minority. It's to protect that minority, its interests, from being eliminated and swollen into the majority, assimilated into the majority. So if I come from a liberal conception, a group right is an antithesis to liberalism. I need to justify it. So we justify it because if we would not accommodate the group, these individuals that happen to be embedded in that group in terms of their own personal autonomy would be losing that autonomy and assimilating when they are interested in maintaining it, okay? That's another qualification factor. But when we come to Israel, Judaism is a non-proselytizing religion. Nobody wants to assimilate me as a Muslim or as a Christian to become Jewish. Nobody is threatening my identity as a non-Jew in terms of my religious identity. So it becomes suspicious. Why are you protecting me, actually, when you're not hindering that identity? On the contrary, the Jewish state is established in terms of maintaining these divides, because otherwise it would lose its identity as a Jewish state. So by definition, I'm preserved and boxed into my identity. So what are you protecting me from when the whole structure is about maintaining this identity? So the first qualification factor does not even exist. And there's a number of other qualifications. Another qualification factor I regard as being, is this something that the minority wants genuinely? And I take up some statistics about the Muslims. Is each and every Muslim guided by the Sharia in his or her daily life? I don't think so. Some are, but I don't think that all Muslims. So why should all Muslims be under that jurisdiction without their choice? Proportionality. If maybe you want to recognize me, why does it have to be exclusive? Okay, why can't you just offer me the option? So it doesn't qualify. This is not multiculturalism. It's whatever it is before it's control, it's maintaining identities. It's that. It's not multiculturalism. So if it's not multiculturalism, what can we do about it? So this is the diagnosis. Okay, and this is where I move to the prognosis. And this is chapter 6. So it's not multiculturalism. And so what can we do about it? Well, first, maybe we should abolish it. But there's no chance, given the forces in play, that this would be available. So would this just lead me to end the discussion? I thought no. And so I proposed 4 kind of strategies that might move us forward in terms of protecting the rights of vulnerable members among the Palestinian Arabs that are subject to that religious authority. And this is what I offer in chapter 6. So one is, right, is let's draw on what's happening and what you're doing, Masua, in terms of the Jewish rabbinical jurisdiction. If that is being liberated from its religious constraints, maybe in terms of legal strategy, let's apply that precedent, stare decisis, okay? So this is what happened to the rabbinical courts. Let's make that happen to the Sharia. And this had an immense impact on the evolution, okay? Not the revolution, the evolution of the jurisdictional authority of the Palestinian Arab religious communities, like, the amendment, the 2001 amendment that was about equalizing the jurisdiction. Just note that terminology of that amendment, it's about equalizing. So there was something happened among the Jews, let's have the same thing. So it's this cut and paste. I also speak of organic transplantation. Let's look at maybe what's happening in some of the Arab countries in terms of some of these jurisdictions and see maybe there are these reforms that you can import. And sometimes, you know, you can just go your own way. If there is this complexity among the Jews about how to define a Jew, as I demonstrated in the surrogacy law, and the religious matching requirement, which happens to be an intra-Jewish matter, okay? So adoption in Israel needs to have, when it happens in Israel, religious matching. Does that necessarily have to happen among the Palestinians? Maybe we can go our own way in this sense. Like in surrogacy, it managed to be the case, because in surrogacy, when the law was enacted, they had a religious matching requirement. The mother donating the egg and the surrogate mother need both to be from the same religion. But then people became conscious. Why? It's because, you know, we don't want to have a doubt about the Jewish identity of the child. If the child comes from an egg donated by a non-Jewish mother and the surrogate mother is Jewish, or vice versa, maybe there is a doubt. So both need to be Jewish. But when both are non-Jewish, they might come from different religions, and that is explicitly offered in the law. And fourth, let's try to have more transparency in terms of what's happening in the religious courts. And so the sun is the best disinfectant. And I think it's something that also applies. Let's see what's happening inside. Publish your decisions. I want to know what laws you're applying, and you know, and what kind of judges. The Christian courts appoint their judges without any kind of overseeing by any public authority. And this is something unacceptable, I think. So these measures, which I call more benevolent, more delicate, is the prognosis, because eliminating the condition is impossible.
So thank you so much. I think we got quite a few questions here, and I think some of them at least were answered during our discussion. So if I'm not referring to a question, see that I thought we answered it already. But here's an interesting question that Ken raised really at the start. And he asked, can you talk more about the effects of the privatization or the delegation of the non-Jewish religious issues for religious freedom and diversity within the minority communities? So the fact, as I understand it at least, the fact that the state is out, how does that affect the inner dynamic within the group, within the minority religion in a way?
Well, sometimes there are some tensions among the communities, and this is something I also discuss. Because of the vast recognition in Israel, and this is like a mirror image, when it comes to the Palestinian as an Arab national group, recognition of their group rights and national identity is minimal, if at all. And the constitutional structure would look at maybe providing individual liberties, but less in terms of group rights. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the religious sphere, and this is another thing that I wrote before, it's totally the opposite image. It's preserving the religious group identity and see it to be your main subject or object of accommodation, and less the individual, to protect the individual against the religious. So when it comes to the national sphere, it's the individual, not the group. When it comes to the religious sphere, right, it's the group and not the individual. And this can promote sometimes tensions, and it did promote certain tensions, like the issue of building the Shahabuddin Mosque in Nazareth, with the tension about having it just, you know, adjacent to the Church of Annunciation, which was the cause of some tension. And these tensions still resonate, not specifically on this issue, but there are certain undercurrents of certain tensions that do exist. It did exist in the issue of the veil in the Catholic school. It was strictly among two Palestinian Arab religious communities in terms of community dynamics, right? It was a Muslim girl from al-Fahim that wanted to attend the Catholic school in Nazareth. And when she was denied, she petitioned the Israeli Supreme Court against the Ministry of Education. It's very interesting in terms of the dynamics, but there are these tensions. And sometimes, there are these intercommunal tensions in Osifia, right? This is another case that I discussed. Halloun, a guy, I think he was Christian, and he wanted to open a bar and serve alcohol beverages and play what was defined by the Supreme Court in Israel as Western music, right? And it was deemed to be offensive to the Druze population. And so the license of that bar was canceled, and there was a petition that followed to the Israeli Supreme Court, and there was also this issue. So tensions do exist, and they happen to be of different character and specifications, but they do exist. The veil, it wasn't just in the issue of the school in Nazareth. I've surveyed the bylaws of almost all of the Christian schools, that their attendees happen to be, in some cases, even 40% or 50% non-Christians, right? And they do have this dress code of wearing only what I designate as being the dress code, not anything else, except one school in Haifa, the Orthodox school college, which does not have a restriction. So, these things do exist, and it's fascinating to see the inner dynamics. Look at the parties, even the secular parties. It does matter who is nominated first. If he's a Muslim, the second maybe should be a Christian, the third maybe, we want to diversify. But after all, it's religion playing. Now, to the Supreme Court in Israel, you have two Christian justices, and now it's a call, maybe, Israel should have a Muslim Supreme Court justice. It does exist, yeah.
Yeah, it's again, I wonder, and we have a few questions. We'll try to keep it short, our discussion, so that we'll get to more questions. But this is so interesting, and I wonder if we could flip the coin, whether we could use these conceptions of so-called multiculturalism to use them in order to promote change, to use them as the opposite, and to claim for recognition. Again, I see it both as within the marginalized, within the Jewish community, also doing it, and apply for recognition to the courts or even to the legislator in order to promote this change.
Yeah, I have an article which was called about this accommodation being a curse or a blessing. And so, yeah, if you regard this to be multicultural, then you should deem whatever I want to do as being legitimate, and you have no say as a state. And this is something, I also propose as being a strategy of a sort. But then you need to galvanize the political will, which is a stakeholder once again, and you're back to square one, right?
That's true. Okay, so let's try another question. This is from Emmanuel Bloch. My question would be whether Professor Karayanni has observed changes over time in the broad picture he has reconstructed for us. Is the situation the same today as it was in 1948? Has it become better or worse? And if so, can we learn from the factors that had an impact on the dilemma to devise new or better strategies?
it's hard to give a better or worse. I think in some respects it's better. Sometimes it's worse. In what sense would I see a change from 1948 among the Palestinian collective, community as a whole? That religion has become politicized much more now in terms of the internal dynamics, and that is certainly true among the Palestinian minority inside of Israel. It wasn't. It was always there, but as a political movement, running to the Knesset and now even competing with major other parties, it is something which has kind of grown over the years. On the other hand, the Palestinian community is much more matured and diverse in terms of its intellectual structure. There is a high percentage of academic graduates. People tend to see what's happening in other places. You have phenomena that you couldn't even imagine. At the Hebrew University, we had a student gathering having the legal status of gays among the Arab communities, and it was discussed publicly. This is something that wouldn't have happened 20 years before. In Kufr Yassif, my village, there was an openly gay individual who tragically was drowned, and we had a funeral in the village, and the turnout and the people coming, I think it was making also a statement of being supportive, and the dynamics, and you would hear things saying, demolishing that individual who just died because of his sexual identity. But then it was a public funeral. People came by the hundreds, if not the thousands, and were there as a demonstration with. So this is something that didn't or couldn't have happened before. So my answer is a mixed answer. In some spheres, you would say change, which is reactive and maybe becoming more fundamentalist in terms of religious identities. In other spheres, it's becoming liberal in terms that you would not have imagined before. So it's more complicated than it seems. So depending on the issue. So we had a conference in Nazareth on my book just two months ago, and it was a pouring of people coming and discussing, the reforms. We need to do something. This cannot be maintained. How can you have these Greek clergy governing this massive church with a lot of property? The Knesset in Israel sits on Greek Orthodox property. Rahavia used to be, it's massive property, and it's governed by these Greek clergy that come. I appeared once before the Greek Orthodox court. I needed a translator to translate my arguments to Greek when I was, pleading in Arabic. This is amazing. What is this? This is multicultural. This is nonsense. It can't be. If it's anything, it's nothing that has to do with multiculturalism. So there is this voice now being echoed in a lot of circles of maybe, let's have a choice. Let's have an option to choice. And maybe moving bottom up would have a better chance from top to bottom in this sense.
Okay, we'll try to take 2 more questions, and then I have a summary question. Let's see if we can pull it off in our 6-7 minutes. Okay, so Uri Regev, it's quite a lot of questions. You won't be able to answer all of them. So just take whichever you want, whichever is easier, and let's do it. So Professor Karayanni presents an analogy and a degree of similarity between the religion and state conflicts and problems that arise in the Jewish community and those that arise in the Palestinian community. Does the book include a statistical comparison between cases that were brought before the Supreme Court by Palestinians and Jews? I would be surprised to hear that the two are indeed statistically comparable. Also, can you clarify what percentage of Israeli Palestinians identify themselves as religious compared to the percentage of Israeli Jews that identify themselves as religious? And similarly, with regard to self-identification as secular, I suggest that there is far apart from each other, that these are far apart from each other. Are there significant NGOs within the Palestinian community that advocate actively for religious freedoms? So not all of them, I guess, but I mean, not all of the questions, but let's try.
Well, statistically, in terms of how many petitions were filed, in terms of comparing what happened in the Jewish community and in the Arab, there isn't a statistical body of reference. But there are a number of cases which I think are important to indicate that a lot of Palestinian Arabs are not refraining from challenging their religious authority just as much as Jewish individuals are challenging. You know, when you come to the court, so if you would look in the book, you would find these two cases. And other cases, I guess, followed, right? But there were precedents. That's why we discuss Supreme Court cases. So one was the case in Fahl. It was a case where a Muslim woman was divorced unilaterally by her husband. And she filed a civil suit. Now, unilateral divorce is something that can happen and is sanctioned by the Sharia. And once that happened, the divorce was complete. But under Israeli penal law, a unilateral divorce is considered to be a crime which is punishable by even a prison sentence. And she took up that penal provision and she filed a case in torts, arguing that performance of the unilateral marriage is a civil tort under a certain provision in the Israeli tort ordinance or the civil wrong ordinance, right? If you don't comply with a statutory provision that is intended to safeguard your interests, you can file a tort, a civil, and it was filed and it was recognized, right? So I think that was bold, and it was, I think, in the 1980s. And I've heard that there are a number of other cases that followed in lower courts. Let's go to the Plunit case from 1995. A Muslim woman in Acre got pregnant out of wedlock. She wasn't married to the person who was allegedly the father of the child that she gave birth to. And that father was married. And so she filed a paternity petition, and coming out and saying, well, I got pregnant out of wedlock is not something you would consider to be a normal thing that would happen. And nonetheless, she came out and she did file such a petition. Muslim organizations did challenge, at least one woman challenged why I can't have a woman arbitrator on an arbitration panel appointed by the Sharia code, and she did succeed. Another Muslim woman would say, well, I lost my husband. She was widowed, and she remarried, and then she lost custody over her children to the husbands, to the first husbands, to the decedent's husbands' brothers, and she did file a petition. So if you would survey the Supreme Court decisions, you would find, and even lower decisions, you'd find a lot of cases that you might consider to be, well, is this exceptional? It exists in terms of statistically how much compared to per disputes, I don't know. Now, in terms of secularism, I have a book here.
I'll say that
yeah.
Just
no, but this
last
is
two
important.
sentences.
This is important, yes, because this claim comes up not necessarily from the person who asked, but this is something. Well, Arabs tend to be conservative, Palestinians. It's not true. There is secular individuals, a lot of secular individuals among the Palestinian Arabs. They might not be as voiceful. And sometimes, people don't hear because they don't have the means of hearing what's happening. But in one statistic I found, in terms of observing religious norms when it comes to certain personal status, there were about 30% that would say, maybe I would opt for a civil kind of recognition, and that two dependent variables that were components, right? It was the level of education and the level of income of these individuals. The higher the level of education and income, the more that they would tend to be I would not say anti-religious side, but they would prefer having some kind of an option, just like a lot of secular Israelis might.
I'll just say that I think I want to just repeat what you just said, that a lot of Israelis don't have the means to see what happens inside the Arab-Palestinian society, and so they think they know the Arab-Palestinian society, and that's part of the confusion Israel is facing as in terms of its own identity. And it won't be questioned because we don't have time, but I want us to perhaps wrap up this conversation, this fascinating conversation, with the idea or thinking whether Israeliness or some sort of inclusiveness, as you talked about in your book, can be a way forward from this entrapment. I want to thank you from all my heart for this interesting and important conversation. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. And thank you, all of you, for joining us today and being so engaged in our conversation. And thank you, Ken. I think you're jumping now. You're muted.
Thank you. I want to echo Masua's deep appreciation to Michael for joining us and talking about his new book. I look forward sometime soon to having him to Berkeley in person. I'm grateful for your work. What an interesting conversation to bring to us about the dark side for subgroups and individuals of so-called multiculturalism and group rights, and also thoughtful analysis about whose interest it is or it is not to stop avenues for vindicating individual rights. And Masua, thank you for leading this conversation. Before we close, I want to flag two upcoming events, both virtual. On Thursday, October 14th, we're going to host a panel on the new governing coalition and shifts in Israeli society. It'll be moderated by Stanford's Janine Zakaria, and we'll welcome to the panel Rami Zidan, scholar of Palestinian-Israeli politics and culture, Tal Schneider from the Times of Israel, and Noah Efron, professor at Bar-Ilan and also the host of the Promised podcast. And then on Thursday, November 4th, we're going to host session 2 of this series with Amal Jamal, the professor of political science from Tel Aviv University, who will talk with Berkeley's own Daniel Zugby about Professor Jamal's new book, Reconstructing the Civic, Palestinian Civic Activism in Israel. Please see the Helen Diller Institute events page for more information on these and other upcoming events. And thank you so much for joining us.